Welcome to Native Bidaské, Native News Online's weekly spotlight on the people making news and leading change in Indian country.
Welcome to another edition of Native Bidaské. I'm Levi Rickert, publisher and editor of Native News Online. Next week on Wednesday, and then the following Wednesday, we're going to have special live streams that's dealing with the deaths, high rates of deaths of overdose in Indian country. And with us tonight, we have a special guest, Dr. Aaron Payment from the Sault Ste. Marie tribe and is a vice president at Kauffman and Associates. Welcome, Aaron. How are you, sir?
Ani, bonjour. I'm doing really well. I'm glad to be here.
Yes. And Aaron, you are an expert on these the opioid overdose, and you've done a lot of research, and you brought along a PowerPoint with you tonight, and I'd like to have you, if you don't mind, just start your presentation and we can go from there.
Absolutely, and we're going to go through it really quick, and I think when we're done, Levi will be able to give you a copy of it so you can see it, and so we'll get started. So I'm going to talk about historical trauma and the effects on tribal communities. Again, I'm Dr. Aaron Payment, Vice President of Tribal Relations and Learning at Kauffman Associates, a Native woman-owned company, and we're really dedicating resources in this area. And so first I want to start out by talking about life expectancy. Last summer, the CDC published a report, unfortunate report, that shows that over a 2-year period, we lost ground. American Indians' life expectancy dropped by about 7 years. And so now we are back to post-World War II in terms of our life expectancy. We believe some of that's related to the pandemic, but we know that a lot of it is related to the opiate challenge and also addiction in our communities, overdose, accidental overdose, and suicide. And so we've lost ground. So I modeled this, and this is a little scary and stark, but I used my own age in this draft equation. And so if life expectancy, if I follow true, if my life matches this life expectancy, then I should expect to live through 2024. That's my age. I'm 58 right now. Life expectancy is about 59 years old. So basically I've got about 6 months or so left. So that's a very scary thing. And when we think about life expectancy, it's not a esoteric term or concept. It's real. And so this is very important to our communities. I wanted to share with you from the Broken Promises report that's U.S. Civil Rights Commission published in 2018 to show you that we have the worst of the worst outcomes across the spectrum. And this is not a doom and gloom scenario or anything like that, but anytime when you're looking at statistics and how do we improve, you need to have a baseline. And so we do have the worst of the worst: alcohol-related deaths, chronic liver disease, diabetes, and you can see on the list, we have the worst of the worst. We have highest rates of poverty, the highest rates of unemployment. We have the lowest high school graduation rate. Our high school graduation rate's about the same disparate difference between Native Americans and the general populations that existed in 1969. So while everybody's improved, American Indians have improved, but the disparity between Native American graduation and the general population is the same as it was in 1969. So we are not improving at the rates that we should. This is just a chart to show you, I think it's from the CDC, and it shows you the increasing overdose rates for American Indian Alaska Natives. We happen to share that distinction with Caucasians. So Caucasians have high rates of overdose and death related to opioids and heroin addiction. This data is from 2014, but you can see that we're parallel with white people in their overdose rates and their opiate and heroin use. This is why the resources are flowing to address the issue. And so just real quickly, if we look back, there's several federal Indian policy periods that shape the reason why we have the worst of the worst outcomes. Through the colonial period, treaty and removal, Indian mission and boarding schools, forced assimilation, reorganization, termination as late as 1950 to 1974, and then self-determination. And so all of those federal policies have an impact on our tribal communities, and they create a cyclical downward trend for which tribes are working to try to pull ourselves up. Okay, so ultimately, the treaties promise health, education, and social welfare into perpetuity, but we remain having the worst plumbing, access to electricity. In Navajo country, a lot of people still do not have access to clean water or electricity. We're a lot of times in rural communities. So the opportunities that are in tribal communities explain in part why we have the worst of the worst outcomes. This is just a picture of the Carlisle Indian School and the Mount Pleasant Indian School closer to home. The official pedagogy, Lieutenant Pratt said, "Kill the Indian to save the man." And unfortunately, that was more than just a motto. A lot of our children never returned home. A lot of trauma happened at these experiences, and that trauma was carried on through generations. A lot of our children learned how not to be affectionate, to avoid being molested by some of the missionaries. And so a lot of our family ties and our culture and our relationships with one another was left not intact as a result of boarding schools. And we have a legacy of these. This isn't ancient history either. The last boarding school was stopped funding in 1969, but in Little Traverse, which is a tribe just an hour and a half from where I live, their boarding school there, the Harbor Springs Holy Child School, closed in 1984. So this is not ancient history. Secretary Holland commissioned the report on the Indian boarding school report, and it revealed some really stark outcomes. So she really gave good attention to an authentic study. And then Brian Newland, who's the assistant secretary, authored the report and didn't mince any words, was very clear about the impact of the federal Indian policy on stripping culture away. Just some statistics of the federal Indian boarding schools out of that report. You can Google that, the investigative report on Indian boarding schools. Please read it, because it's something that everybody should know and understand. And so this is a quote right from the report: "Territorial dispossession and Indian assimilation through militarized and identity-altering methodologies to assimilate American Indian Alaska Native people, primarily children, under the rubric of education." Like I said, they didn't mince words in publishing this report. Okay, so when children left their homes and they had their culture and language intact, when they went back to their communities, they did not have fully intact their culture or language, and many times they were ostracized and they were treated differently because they were different at that point. Also, to prevent children from running away from the boarding schools, they told them that their parents were dead, and then when they tried to practice their ritual to send the spirit off to the spirit world, they were not allowed to, because they were not allowed to speak the language, and they were punished if they were practicing their pagan ways. Native kids were given English names, and for a lot of tribes, our purpose, our very identity is in our names. And so by genericizing their names and giving them Bob or Sally or whatever the names were, rather than their traditional names, they could not carry forward their purpose. This begins a long process of cultural discontinuity, of stripping away culture and identity. Unfortunately, there's a disproportionate number of grave sites that exists at these boarding schools. This is going to be in the next report, some kind of an accounting of the number of children who never came home. Some of them are being repatriated now, but it's one of the saddest chapters in our history. So just real quickly, all of this culminates into an understanding of some social theory, which is historical and intergenerational trauma. And so for general social scientists, what that is that's Durkheim's social enemy, which means with normlessness comes a lack of identity, high rates of alcoholism, suicide, nomadic lifestyles, and we happen to have the worst. And so there's the evidence that we are in a perpetual state of historical and intergenerational trauma. And then also critical race theory explains the context for which we find ourselves in the lives that we live today, with less opportunity for jobs, food deserts. And so that perpetuates. So while historical trauma, even if we're healing, the perpetuation of the worst is because of the environments in which we live. Okay, and so I just have a couple slides that I dropped in. I'm not going to go through them, but Braveheart is the author, the seminal author on historical and intergenerational trauma. I urge you to reach out, and you can see some of the responses or the outcomes of historical trauma: depression, PTSD, low self-esteem, suicidal ideation, substance abuse, disassociation. And of course, that author is Mariah Yellowhorse Braveheart. She's a PhD, and she's the seminal expert in this topic. And then this is just when I was doing my dissertation to understand it, cultural dilution from at the top, where we had traditional ways of knowing and we lived in our traditional lifestyles. And then we were forced to go to boarding schools. The purpose was to assimilate us and force the Indian, to kill the Indian out of us. And so over time, there's a cultural dilution. And with that, you see an increased outcome of suicides, alcoholism, the worst of the worst outcomes. So while we can't say it's causal, there's a very strong correlation between these experiences and the outcomes. Okay, and then the Behavioral Health Agenda was created in a joint effort between NIHB, National Indian Health Board, National Congress of American Indians, SAMHSA, and HHS. And so this already exists. It's a practice guide basically to explain how tribal communities can address some of the historical trauma in their respective communities. And if you go online, just Google Tribal Behavioral Health Agenda. HHS and IHS and SAMHSA are working on updating this, but this is a very good practitioner's guide for how do you address these issues in your respective communities. These outcomes are not going away until we address them. And so one final graphic that I wanted to share, and we can open up for dialogue with Levi, is this social ecological model basically prescribes how tribal communities can begin to address and organize and socially engineer a community back to our original communities, at least simulated in many ways. But you have to focus on the individual, interpersonal, organizational, community, and policy levels, and plot out action plans at each one of those levels. You cannot address one of these levels without systemically addressing all these levels. And that means having, and no pun intended, having a sober assessment of what your tribal communities are doing. And if you're selling alcohol at your convenience store or in your casino, you need to be honest about what can you do in your community to create an environment that will simulate the type of environment that we lived in long before we had these challenges. It can be done, but it does take planning in order for that to happen. And with that, we'll open up for any conversation. Levi?
Well, thank you, Aaron, for that presentation. It was kind of high level, and hopefully our viewers will be able to take away some of those key points. And, you know, next week we're having the Reducing Drug Overdose Deaths in Indian Country. Native News Online is producing it. Kauffman and Associates, one of the sponsors, and we thank you for that. And to our viewers, you can see it on next Wednesday, October 18th, on Facebook, YouTube, in the new X, now formerly known as Twitter. So and then the following Wednesday, we're going to come back. The first segment will be about the problem, and then the second week edition will be about some of the solutions, some things that tribes are doing. And that will be on Wednesday, the 25th at 3 p.m. Eastern time. So, Dr. Payment, you've been studying this. You've been on several task force. You were on the HHS, Secretarial Tribal Advisory Council, as I recall. And tell me this: how long has this been a problem in Indian country?
Oh, since intervention, unfortunately. For me, on a personal level, I grew up in a family that was afflicted by drugs and alcohol and addiction. I originally studied to become a substance abuse counselor, and my family is devastated by drugs and alcohol. My sister attempted suicide about 30 years ago. She's recovering now, and she's the director of our behavioral health division at my tribe.
Oh, wow.
She's a very healthy. She has her doctorate degree in evaluation research. So this is longstanding. And, one of the lonely aspects of being sober and successful is that there's not many people for us to hang out with or socialize with. And also when, you can't fully enjoy your successes when you see your family members struggle, and it's ongoing. And so it's up to each one of us, especially those of us who become aware of the origins of historical trauma, to work as a collaborative to try to find solutions. Kauffman is rededicating our efforts. Kauffman and Associates, our president is Joanne Kauffman. We've been around for over 30 years, and we just rededicated our efforts to dealing with this issue. And we hired Dr. Joni Buffalo Head, who is going to be with you next week, and she is phenomenal. So I'm a former tribal leader. I'm an academic. I've studied this area. I've lived this, but she is going to bring another level of expertise when you meet with her. So I'm really grateful that you're going to do that.
Yeah, I'm happy that she's going to be there, and we have already done some preliminary planning and had some conversations, and I am really impressed with her knowledge level. So I was at Grand Valley State University recently, and Justice Allie Maldonado, right? She's on the
Maldonado.
Yeah, she's on the Michigan Court of Appeals. And I was telling her about our live stream. She said, "Hold on,
the first American Indian."
Yes. So I was telling her about our live stream. She says, "Hold on." She went and got her purse. Now, this is a justice on the Michigan Court of Appeals. She took out a box of Narcan. She said, "I carry this with me. I never know when I'm going to need it." And I think that speaks volumes to. This was unscripted, right? She didn't know I was even talking about that, but she went and said, "Hold on." She went, got her purse, brought it over to me, showed me that. And the idea that a Michigan Court of Appeals justice carries this with her speaks volumes of her knowledge level of the problems that we have in Indian country. And could you comment on that?
Yeah, I carry a kit in my car too. So I have immediate family nieces that are addicted. In fact, I'm raising one of my nieces, her children, because she's struggling, and so nobody plans to accidentally overdose. It happens, and we could have a judgment about that. We could form an opinion about that, but our family members, our people that are afflicted, deserve our compassion and care and our love and our support. And if you happen to be in a situation where all it's going to take is for you to do an inhaler or a mist that can save their lives, I'm going to do it. Mm-hmm. I don't like the fact that she's addicted, but if that will save her life. And, the one thing is, for people that are hearing this, you might think, oh, geez, they're from a bad family. And while my family's not like a really, really good family, we're a typical family, right? But middle-class white people, young people, are dying of overdose rates at the same rate as American Indians. We have the distinction of the two of us of having the worst of the worst. That was in my presentation. Mm-hmm. And so it's time for us to get past the stigma and past the judgment and recognize that you could be the person that saves their life. Mm-hmm. And it could be a loved one. And if you didn't take the measure of having it available and they die and you didn't have the prevention or the opportunity to save their lives, it's going to feel really, really bad. And so that's a sad commentary on where we are in society until we can find solutions. But if you can save somebody's life, I urge anybody, a lot of times these kits are free. Tribal communities can contact their law enforcement, or they can contact their behavioral health divisions and get these kits for free.
Yes, and I think it's the National Indian Health Board just sent out a notice, and we published a story earlier this week that tribes have until October 15th to order these kits, to apply for these kits, and they'll be free of charge. So I'm so happy. And during your presentation, you talked a lot about historical trauma, and I do want to say this, and you kind of alluded to it. This is a problem that is so pervasive across the country. It doesn't just, we're talking about Indian country, but this happens in white suburbia all the time. People are dying of overdoses. And so I want to be clear about that. So if there's anyone in the audience thinking that, well, we're just playing the victim, but I guess, and I've been talking to our journalists this year in particular, that in our reporting, we really want to get to where the rubber hits the road in Indian country. What is our realities? You can get all the nice fancy press releases from the government. They're going to do this, they're going to do X, Y, Z, and maybe a tribe's going to do all this. But our realities are harsh. And as you mentioned, it can happen in anybody's family. And so talk about that historical trauma. Is that, would you say, is one of the major contributing factors to why our people are using substances? And it can be alcohol or it could be drugs. Speak to that, please.
Yeah. So this, sometimes people gloss over when academics talk about the subject, but it's very simple. The original researcher was Emil Durkheim, and he talked about social enemy. And all that is when we moved from agricultural society to industrial revolution, and we moved from communities to urban settings, we lost something in that transition. We lost our local cultures. And no matter what your background, your ethnicity, we lost that. And the result of that was high rates of suicide, alcoholism, nomadic lifestyles, and low education attainment. Those happen to be the same outcomes from historical and intergenerational trauma. Now, what we had was a little different. We had a concentrated effort by the federal government to strip us of our culture and identity on purpose. And it was in part to get out of the treaty and trust obligation, but the outcomes are the same. And so the answer, very simply, so it doesn't have to be this highbrow academic dissertation here, but very simply is to return culture and language. And to provide, and the federal government has a duty, has a responsibility to do that, dollar per dollar. For every dollar they spent on stripping us of our culture and our language, they owe us that duty. They also owe us the treaty and trust obligation, health, education, and social welfare into perpetuity. And so it's time for us to reconcile this. Deb Holland's report, Brian Newland's authoring of the report, has got a federal attention and a national attention on this. And the work that you're doing, Levi, is appreciated because other people are beginning to understand that the answer is in returning culture and language. When that happens, we're going to become whole people again. Now, does that mean that we have to give up our television, our computer? No. Our culture has always said that we can add and synthesize what we learn along the way. It's take what you need and leave the rest. We can live in a hybrid society, but we will be much more fulfilled when we go back to our cultural teachings, our purpose in our name, and understanding that so that we can live out those full lifestyles and then teach our next generations to appreciate that. They're at a much better advantage today than we were because of the social stigma of being Indian. And today, that stigma is going away. And so the next generations hold great promise for helping to bring our culture and language back.
Yes. And so much attention is given to this subject matter of the opioids that up in Tulalip back in August, they actually had the first opioid conference. Over 1,000 Native Americans and non-natives, our allies were there, tribal leaders, regular tribal members, and those on the front line with behavior health. And 1,000. So I guess I bring that up to say I'm really happy that this attention is being shown to the subject and that people are reacting. Over 1,000 people showed up at a conference. This is a nice sized conference. I don't care what you're selling or what you're talking about. If you have 1,000 people show up at a conference, it's a successful conference. But sadly, Dr. Payment, just a month or so later, up the road at Lummi tribe in Washington State, 4 people died in 1 week, and Native News Online reported on it. And the tragedy is that the woman who is on the front line goes in and brings some remedial things, Narcan, with her, because sometimes if overdose has taken place and there are other people may be in stress too. And so she shows up. The 4th victim was her son. And that just that just broke my heart when I said, and we had already planned on the live streams that are coming up. And so to our viewers, this is something we are taking so seriously that yes, we have all the other issues that are going on in Indian country, the Road to Healing tour that we cover, the Indian boarding schools, repatriation, and on. But our real problems that are happening are some of the drug overdoses that are taking place to our relatives and our family, our friends. And so, Dr. Payman, what's next on the horizon? What can be done?
Well, they're all related. So they're not distinct or separate. They're all, the origin is from historical and intergenerational trauma and federal Indian policy. What can be done? One of those leaders from Lummi is my good friend Nick Lewis, who's on the council for Lummi, and also he's the vice president or vice chair of the National Indian Health Board. And I got to see him develop his leadership in this area. He's always been committed to it, but I got to see him at the national level at a SAMHSA consultation that I facilitated, and he's really coming into his own. But it's that kind of leadership that tribal leaders are stepping forward. They made some immediate changes in their community and passed resolutions to address the issue. You know, there's a law enforcement aspect to this issue, but also a healing aspect. And, you know, we don't have to do one or the other. You have to do all of the above to address this. And so I know at Kauffman, we just changed our approach in behavioral healing and our behavioral healing team. We hired a new person, an expert. There's a lot of resources that are coming down from the federal government to deal with this, tribal opiate response funding. But what we need is the federal government to push these dollars out in a formula way so that we don't have to compete against each other to get these dollars. They need to make them available. They need to provide technical assistance to help tribes develop their plans. You know, several years ago, they started doing tribal action plans under SAMHSA and Department of Justice. But at this point, we need to take some models and some archetypes and help develop them and push them out to tribes so tribes can take the money, adopt the plan, and then they can change their plan as they go along. And so I think the leadership that's happening is we're at a stage right now. A lot of it is in part because of Deb Holland and Brian Newland. We're seeing a level of attention like we've never seen before. The BIA Native Language Revitalization Project that's happening is a 10-year plan that's being developed to help bring back language and culture. And so there's a lot more that we need to do, but we need to move away from competitive funding and move to formula funding and truly fulfill the treaty and trust obligation, the health, education, and social welfare into perpetuity. And it's time that dollar per dollar, the federal government return what they took away from us.
And Chimigwich to you, Dr. Payment. We've been talking with Dr. Payment, who is Aaron Payment, who is a friend. First of all, is a friend of mine, brother from a sister tribe up in Michigan, and he is a vice president at Kauffman and Associates, and they are a proud sponsor of our Reducing Drug Overdose Deaths in Indian Country. And so please tune in next week, Wednesday, and then the following Wednesday, October 18th, October 25th. Put it on your calendar, 3 p.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time. It'll be on Facebook, X, and our YouTube channels. So Chimigwich, and we will be back next week with another episode of Native Bidaské. Thank you, sir.
Miigwech.
If you appreciate what we do here at Native News Online, we invite you to donate to support our continued work covering Indian country. You can scan this code with your smartphone or go to the link located below this video to donate today. We greatly appreciate your support. Please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And be sure to scan this code or go to the link below to subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you for joining us today, and please be sure to join us again next week for another episode of Native Bidaské. Chi miigwech.